This is a poem that I wrote some years ago, and it's called It Was My Sin. In fear he came under cover of night, with an angry crowd baying for blood. Did Judas really think men could keep him safe? How little of Christ's power he understood. The kiss, a universal symbol of love, was the sign of betrayal that night, but obedient to his Father, the Son of Man was led away without a fight. How could he betray the Son of Man? How could he commit such a sin? But Judas was merely an instrument of God, for it was my sin that really betrayed him. Hardened soldiers of Rome interrogated Christ, raining blows to his body and face. In those torturous hours, while they had their fun, God granted them immeasurable grace. The crown of thorns pierced his holy brow, ruthless cruelty causing searing pain. Their whips flailed the skin from his sacred back as they beat him again and again. My tears flow freely as I think of his pain. How could they do this to Christ? But those soldiers were merely an instrument of God, for it was my sin that whipped him that night. Peter vowed, "Though I die, I will not betray you." But from Gethsemane he fled in fear. Then, following at a distance in the cold of night, with others, to the fire he drew near. 3 times he denied his friendship with Christ, but as the cock crowed, his heart was struck. For at that sound, Jesus glanced at his friends. Did their eyes meet as he turned to look? Peter wept bitterly as conviction flooded his soul. Through stinging tears, the scene before him grew dim. But I cannot criticize him when I know in my heart that by my sin I reject and deny him. Christ's silence when questioned caused Pilate to be amazed. "I have the power to crucify you," he claimed. Christ replied, "You have no authority but that given from above." Knowing in all that was happening, God reigned. "Whom shall I release?" the governor asked the crowd. "You choose, the king or the killer?" Then he washed his hands as the mob replied, "Crucify him! Release Barabbas the sinner!" Neither Pilate nor the crowd sent Christ to his death. God's voice of justice from heaven did cry. These people were merely instruments of God, for it was my sin that condemned him to die. The weight of the cross was just too much to bear, his body weak, but there was worse to suffer, for he staggered the length of that long, lonely road that led to the place called Golgotha. The ringing sound of hammer against nails echoed throughout the realms of heaven, and at the thud, as the cross dropped into the ground, God whispered, "For you, my son, I have given." Darkness fell as the Father turned away from the sin Christ was bearing as he took his last breath. But the cross was merely an instrument of God, for it was my sin that demanded his death. Judas betrayed him with a kiss, the symbol of love. But it's my sin that brought him from heaven above. By soldiers his body was broken for me, for it was my sin that brought about Calvary. Peter denied his friendship with Christ 3 times that night, but by my sin I deny him his place in my life. It wasn't Pilate that condemned my Saviour to death. It was my sin. Sin he bore as he took his last breath. Mere nails could not hold God's Son on that cross, but my sin held him firm. As for me, he paid the cost. God's justice demanded a sacrificial lamb. It's my sin that crucified the great I am. God knew that of myself I could not do good, and it's my sin that's cleansed by his precious blood.